Hello and welcome to Good Evening Britain, a Force for Good's weekly show, coming to you live from our studios here in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow, with me, your host, Alistair McConnachie. We are broadcasting on all our digital platforms throughout the United Kingdom and across the world. We're bringing you quality pro-UK comment and analysis every Wednesday from 7 until 8 p.m. on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, and on TikTok. Folks, please do send in your greetings. Please tell us where you are viewing from. Please send in your questions and your comments. We love to hear from you. This is the show where we're British, we love the United Kingdom, and we want to stay together. And if that's you, please keep watching. And if that's not you, please keep watching anyway, because you might learn something. And either way, I know you're going to enjoy the show. We are in a fight here, folks, for the hearts and minds and souls of the people of the United Kingdom. And you can help us with our message if you click on the thumbs up button on YouTube or on Facebook. Give us a like. Please give us a share. Please do follow us on whatever platform you may be watching on. And if you're watching on X, formerly known as Twitter, please do give us a repost. And if you give us a quote repost, tell folks how much you enjoy the show, tell them to tune in, then we can retweet you to 28,000 people, and that's definitely counts for something. So folks, going to be a good show tonight, big show. We're looking forward to it. The crux of the show is going to be looking at Humza's hate law once again. Last week we went into it in considerable depth. That did very well on our social media platforms, I'm glad to say. In fact, this show, this 1 hour show last week got over 1,700 views on YouTube, which for us is extremely good going. Some of the videos which we cut from last week's show and put out on YouTube got over 6,500 views on YouTube, which again is extremely good for us. So folks, we're going to be continuing to look at Humza's hate speech law, and in particular tonight we're going to be looking at the defences which people will be allowed under the law. So we're going to try to figure out what can and what cannot be spoken about. We're going to try to figure out the full extent of what that law may be prohibiting, as much as we can in the circumstances and the time that we've got available. Good evening to people coming in on TikTok. Andy says, vote Reform UK. There'll be a few people, no doubt, who agree with you or disagree with you. Chuck says the SNP are the far right and that independence will break up Scotland itself, not just the United Kingdom. Teppy says, how are you doing, Alistair? Very well on this great British evening here in our wonderful city of Glasgow. I hope you're doing well as well, Teppy's. Good to see everybody else joining in there as well. Also good on J.K. Rowling for standing her ground regarding the stupid new Hate Speech Crime Act. And what Derek's referring to there is that somebody had said to J.K. Rowling that they were going to, I don't know if they're going to report her or do something like that once the law comes into force on the 1st of April. And so this person advised J.K. Rowling to delete all her tweets where she had called somebody a man, and they didn't like that. And she turned round and said, no, I'm not going to delete them. And the way it looks like is that she's quite going to come out quite strongly on just continuing to say what she's always said. And so tonight, when we're looking at the defences that are available within the law, then we'll be considering what grounds she has to stand so boldly and whether or not she's likely to get away with that. That's coming up very, very soon. Well, let's go straight into the anti-free speech law, otherwise known as the Hate, Crime and Public Order Scotland Act 2021, which is coming into force on the 1st of April. Now, this is a law which was passed by Holyrood on the 11th of March 2021, 3 years ago. And it's very unusual for a law to be passed and take so long to actually come into effect. It was passed on the 11th of March 2021, and it became an official law on the 23rd of April 2021 when it was given royal assent. However, a clause in it stated that it wouldn't become law until the date that the Scottish Parliament decided that it would come into law. So it was like a law that just sat there, but it wasn't in effect. It was just sitting there waiting in the wings. And we now see 3 years later why it took them so long. Because while we were looking the other way, what the people tasked with this law were doing was embedding it throughout what they like to call Scottish civil society. That is, they went to all the government organisations and all the organisations and NGOs which depend upon Scottish executive money, and they said to them, will you become an official hate crime reporting centre? So if you go to Police Scotland's website, you can actually find every area of Scotland has a reporting centre, has lots of reporting centres, and these are all government quangos of some kind, or organisations which are sympathetic in some way for whatever reason, or NGOs that depend upon Scottish executive money. So in other words, they embedded it into civil society in such a way so that they had lots of supporters, and the people who depended upon their money were behind it, as it were. So they've really spread this throughout Scotland to ensure that the non-governmental sector is fully on side. And the idea of these reporting centres is, if you're too embarrassed to go into a police station, then perhaps you can go into a sex shop in, is it Glasgow or Edinburgh, that's also a reporting centre. Or there's a mushroom farm that's also a reporting centre. Or there's various housing associations which are also reporting centres. So if somebody calls you a nasty name, you don't want to go into the police centre, the police office. Maybe you'd prefer to go into your local housing association and complain about it. Frankly, I would rather go into a police station and complain about it. But there you go, each to their own. So they've taken so long in doing this because they've wanted to ensure that when it comes out, they've got their army of grassies, as it were, throughout Scotland, ready to enable it, ready to make it happen, ready to make all these reports about all these nasty people. So we've been clear that we don't like this law because we don't believe that emotion should be a crime in itself. You know, you should, if you incite to a crime, like if you incite somebody to commit arson, or if you incite somebody to commit a violent assault, of course that should be a crime, because arson and assault, these are crimes. And so if you incite to a crime, that's a criminal act as well. So what the clever people did many years ago was they thought, well, why don't we make the emotion of hatred an official crime? So that these people like Alistair McConnachie, who say, oh, it should only be a crime if you incite to a crime. Well, he can't say that anymore, can he? If the crime itself is hatred. So, very clever, convoluted little play with words that they did. But it's that's where we are. That's where we are at the moment. But the problem with actually making it a law is it's very subjective. It's very subjective what constitutes hatred. And as we explained last week, there's two parts to this law. There's being threatening and abusive, or in some cases insulting, but that must be paired with the intention to stir up hate, or the likelihood of stirring up hate. So that then requires us to ask, well, what's threatening? What's abusive? What's insulting? What does stirring up even mean in any particular context? And what does intending? How can you prove the intention to stir up hatred? These are all subjective points of view. And certainly, how can you prove the likelihood that hatred may be stirred up by such quote-unquote threatening or abusive or insulting words? So it's an absolute playground for lawyers, and it's an absolute subjective playground for the judges and the jurors as well. So it's not a clear law, and it's not really intended to be clear, because its main purpose is political. That's to say, it's a legal concept intended deliberately for the political purpose of control, suppression and punishment of what could otherwise be considered legitimate political debate. And the fear of being convicted can stop people saying what needs to be said in order to do what needs to be done. And in that sense, the threat of a hate speech criminal conviction can be used as a political tool to suppress and silence your political opponents, to criminalise legitimate political debate. So that's the real political objection to this. It can be used to, what they're saying, chill political debate, chill freedom of speech. It can have a chilling effect on freedom of speech, by which is meant it can suppress it. And that's before we even look at the whole field of frivolous complaints. Frivolous meaning not having any serious purpose or value. People can make frivolous complaints about their neighbours, or about people that they got into an argument with, or people that they've had a political discussion with, or people that they've lost an argument to down the pub, or something like that. Frivolous complaints which should not be wasting police time, should not be wasting police money, should not be wasting police resources. So there's going to be a whole load of frivolity which is going to come in the wake of this. And there's also going to be a load of vexatious complaints. Vexatious being a legal term meaning instituted without sufficient grounds and serving only to cause annoyance to the defendant. So, in addition to the political reasons to oppose this, there's also the basic reasons that there's going to be a lot of frivolous and a lot of vexatious complaints that are going to waste police time and money, which are going to be unfair to the unjustly accused. And the only beneficiaries of this is going to be the legal profession, which again will have a whole new financial playground to exploit. In other words, there's going to be a whole lot of what Shakespeare said, much ado about nothing. Nobody benefiting except the legal firms. And at this point, I would just like to say to our people that we shouldn't go along with this. I see some of our people on the internet they're seeing things that they don't like politically. And some people are rushing too quickly to go, oh, that's hateful. That shouldn't be allowed. Why shouldn't it be allowed? Just because you don't like it, just because you might find it offensive, just because some people might not like it at all. You shouldn't be criminalising it. That's just life. You go through life and you're going to find a lot of people don't agree with you on a lot of matters. You shouldn't rush to the law to solve it. So, and I see like the Tory government doing this a lot as well. It's like, oh, we need to bring in new laws about extremism or hate or whatever. No, we don't. We don't. What we need to do is to stand boldly for the old school, traditional British view of freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly for everybody, and not to go along with these hate crimes, hate speech crimes. We're talking here about hate speech. We're not talking about violent crimes that are aggravated by racial prejudice. We're not talking about those things. We're talking about speech crimes here. Crimes of speech, either spoken or displayed in print in some way. Providing they're not inciting to a genuine crime, then a whole lot can be allowed. And in this regard, let's look at the title of yesterday's Herald, the front page of yesterday's Herald. Police told to target comics under new hate crime law. And so that is in fact what they've been told. I wondered if that was maybe a bit of a clickbait. I bought the paper, I read it, and I checked up on the explanatory notes that accompany this bill. And indeed, performers can be accused of threatening or abusive, or in some cases insulting language, which could, when it's paired with the intention to stir up hatred, or the likelihood of stirring up hatred, then they could indeed be convicted. So that's really quite remarkable. We'll just look at that in a minute. Firstly, though, how does a prosecution happen? Well, what happens is that somebody can complain. Now, anybody can complain if they think there's been a hate crime. It doesn't have to be directed at you. If you witness something that somebody said to another person and you go, well, I don't like that, you can be the person who complains about it. And you can be the person who says that you consider it to be hateful. And the police are obliged to then investigate it. They will then take their report to, in Scotland, the Procurator Fiscal, who will decide whether or not to prosecute. And if the Procurator Fiscal decides to prosecute, then it goes to court. And a judge or a judge and jury will look at it. And if it's a judge and jury, you could be facing up to 7 years in prison for such a thing. Another point is that police have said that only incidents after the 1st of April are to be considered, are to be investigated. However, here's the thing. If someone made a tweet, say J.K. Rowling made a tweet back in February, and you find the tweet and you think, oh, this is good, I'm going to repost it, and you repost it, then that will be an incident that occurred after the 1st of April, regardless of when the tweet itself was written. So, just because tweets were published prior to the 1st of April doesn't mean that they can't become a current thing. Doesn't mean that they can't be investigated by the police after the 1st of April. Because retweeting is one of the behaviours that will be potentially investigated. So let me look firstly then at, just to remind you of the actual problem here. And it's here are the two offences. Offences relating to stirring up hatred. They fall under Part 3, Section 4. A person commits an offence if the person behaves in a manner that a reasonable person would consider to be threatening, abusive, or insulting. Okay, so there's the three things: threatening, abusive, and insulting. One or the other, or all two or three together. And communicates that to another person, or communicates that to another person, that a reasonable person would consider to be threatening, abusive, or insulting. So basically, 4.1 Part A here is that the matter must be threatening, abusive, or insulting and communicated, and in doing so, the person intends to stir up hatred against a group of persons based on the group being defined by reference to race, colour, or nationality, or ethnic or national origins. So that's a racial thing they're talking about there. Or a reasonable person would consider the behaviour or the communication of the material to be likely to result in hatred being stirred up against that person. Let's actually bring that up as we've got it here. That'd be easier to read. Let's scroll down to Part 3. Paragraph 1, A and B are about crimes related to, so-called crimes related to race, colour, nationality, ethnic or national origins. And then paragraph 2 is a relatively new concept. The other offence is if the person behaves in a manner that a reasonable person would consider to be threatening or abusive, or communicates to another person material that a reasonable person would consider to be threatening or abusive. And in doing so, the person intends to stir up hatred against a group of persons based on their characteristics mentioned here, which is age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, or variations in sex characteristics. So basically, Section 4, paragraphs 1 and 2 cover these offences against people on racial grounds, national grounds, ethnic grounds, national origin grounds, and also on these other characteristics. So it's like the full package there, really. There are a couple of small but crucial differences, though. In paragraph 1, when you're talking about race, you're not allowed to be threatening, abusive, or insulting on the grounds of race. However, when it comes to the grounds of the various other characteristics, you're not allowed to be threatening or abusive. But insulting has been left out, leading some people to wonder if being insulting to the people with the specific characteristics other than race, leading some people to wonder if you're allowed somehow to be insulting to them and not get caught under the law. We checked the explanatory notes, and the explanatory notes don't really help us to understand that any better. Furthermore, under race, you mustn't intend to stir up hatred, and your behaviour must not be likely to result in hatred being stirred up. However, under the characteristics, it's only the intention to stir up hatred which is a potential crime. They dropped the idea that your threatening or abusive language could be likely to stir up hatred. These are things that you want to avoid doing. And the question is, to what extent will people simply talking about race or nationality or national origins or people's age or religion or sexual orientation? To what extent will these things even be allowed to be spoken about? That's everybody's big fear. And so we get to the defences. And paragraph 4 says, it is a defence for a person charged with an offence under this section to show that the behaviour or the communication of the material was, in the particular circumstances, reasonable. So that's really quite a wide defence, I'm glad to say, because you can be speaking about sexual orientation or religion or race, and you can make the defence that it's simply a reasonable thing that you could be speaking about and that it should be heard. And that should cover a lot of defences, to be quite frank with you. It goes further here as well with paragraph 5. For the purposes of subsection 4, by which I mean the paragraph that's just been read, in determining whether behaviour or communication was reasonable, particular regard must be had to the importance of the right to freedom of expression by virtue of Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, including the general principle that the right applies to the expression of information or ideas that offend, shock, or disturb. Again, that's actually good to see, because that's a wide-ranging defence. It's putting into law that you have to consider Article 10, which we'll look at in a second, including the general principle that the right applies to the expression of information or ideas that offend, shock, or disturb. So if somebody says they're offended by it, by what you've just said, then you can say, well, Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights is my defence. To what extent does it give a defence? Let's look at Article 10. Article 10, freedom of expression. Now, this is law in the United Kingdom, and it's also written into the Human Rights Act, which is a British law. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authorities and regardless of frontiers. Then it's got a little bit there about the licensing of broadcasting, television or cinema enterprises, which doesn't affect us. It then goes on to qualify that right to freedom of expression. And it says the exercise of these freedoms, since it carries with it duties and responsibilities, may be subject to such formalities, conditions, restrictions or penalties as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society, in the interests of... So what it's basically saying here is that nations are allowed to set up laws which will set formalities or conditions or restrictions or penalties, if necessary, in a democratic society, in the interests of national security, territorial integrity or public safety, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, for the protection of the reputation or rights of others, for preventing the disclosure of information received in confidence, or for maintaining the authority and impartiality of the judiciary. So it's saying there that you have freedom of expression, but the nation has a right to set up laws to curb that if it deems necessary for those reasons. That is, national security, territorial integrity, public safety, prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, or for the protection of the reputation or rights of others. And as far as this hate speech crime of Humza's is concerned, this, from his perspective, would be a law to protect, as he sees it, the quote-unquote rights of others. So if you were in court and you claimed that Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights gave you the right to speak freely, you would have a strong case. However, the prosecutor would say, well, Article 10 also allows us, the state, to set up a law to curb your freedom of speech if we deem it to be for the protection of the rights of others. In this case, the people that we've said and listed here under the categories of race and colour and nationality and age and sex and religion and so on and so forth. So it would then be up to the judge and the jury to decide where the balance lay. But you do have a defence under Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, or if we were not in the European Convention of Rights, under the British Human Rights Act, which has exactly the same clause written into it. But it is a powerful defence, and it should prevent a lot of cases going to law. Now, what other defences are allowed to us under this Act? Let us scroll down to paragraph 9. Part 3, Section 4, Para 9, Protection of Freedom of Expression. For the purposes of Section 4.2, now Section 4.2 is the law against threatening or abusive behaviour based on the characteristics of people's age, disability, religion, or sexual orientation. Behaviour or material is not to be taken to be threatening or abusive solely on the basis that it involves or includes discussion or criticism of matters relating to those protected characteristics of age, disability, sexual orientation, transgender identity, and variations in sex characteristics. So you're still allowed to discuss those matters. Isn't that wonderful? You're still allowed to discuss matters related to age. You're still allowed to criticise, interestingly enough, those characteristics as well, if you perhaps believe them to be worthy of criticism. You're still allowed to do that. Well, isn't that so gracious that we're allowed to still discuss and criticise such matters? And that's not, discussion and criticism as such is not considered to be threatening or abusive per se. Well, thank you for that. That's something, I suppose. And then it goes on to say, discussion or criticism relating to or expressions of antipathy, dislike, ridicule, or insult towards religion is not to be taken to be considered threatening or abusive. Okay, so just because you talk about or express antipathy towards or dislike or ridicule or insult religion, whether religions generally, or a particular religion, or religious beliefs or practices, that should not in itself be considered to be threatening or abusive. Which is interesting, to say the least, because you'll notice here you are essentially allowed, or rather, you're not presumed to be necessarily threatening or abusive just because you're expressing dislike, ridicule, or even insulting religion or religious beliefs. So you've got, if you're the sort of person that likes to do that, if you're the sort of person that likes to express dislike, ridicule, or insult, then you've got a freer hand on religious matters. You can go to town on that, apparently. That freedom is not allowed for you if you're referring to age, disability, sexual orientation, transgender identity, or variations in sex characteristics. So with characteristics such as those, you can discuss and criticise them without being considered to be threatening or abusive. But with religion, you can not only discuss or criticise, but you can actually express antipathy, dislike, ridicule or insult towards religion, but not to the other characteristics. So there's a couple of small defences there built in. So what are we to make of that? Basically, if you get accused of being insulting on the basis of race or colour or nationality, then your main defence, perhaps your only defence, is Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. If you get accused of insulting on the basis of the characteristics of age, disability, sexual orientation, transgender identity or others, then you have the Article 10 defence, but you also have the paragraph 9 defences here. And in particular, you have the defence on religion, which allows you to go to town, basically, is probably typical of our generally godless age, which doesn't seem to mind criticism of religion as much as it minds criticism of other characteristics. So, that's the defences. And it'll be interesting to see who gets taken to court and who doesn't get taken to court. But generally these things can often be political. The law is often downstream of the culture of the day, and it depends upon the culture of the police, and it depends upon the culture in the prosecutor's office, and then it depends upon the wider culture in society that throws up the judges and the jurors. And so we'll just have to see who it is that gets done on these matters. But it is going to have the effect of chilling freedom of speech. It's going to have the effect of confusing a lot of people as to what they can and cannot say. Hopefully they can continue to push the boundaries of as much as possible. But it is a restriction, and it is a deliberate restriction, and it is a restriction that's been brought in for political purposes. And it's interesting that it's happening throughout the Western world at the moment. Today, the Parliament of the Republic of Ireland is debating its own hate speech law. And so you do wonder to what extent that the elite is coordinating this across the West, certainly across the British Isles. Now, somebody asked earlier, can this be stopped? And let's spend a few moments just looking at that. Now, people will blame the SNP for this, but it's really the Greens that are at the bottom of this. They're at the root of a lot of the bad things that are happening in Scotland. But together it's the SNP and the Greens that have brought this in. However, we shouldn't just say it was the SNP and Greens, because back on the 11th of March 2021, the vote was had, and let's just bring up who all voted for it. Indeed, we are pleased to say that we wrote an article and called the Free Speech Hall of Shame and Fame. And here it is here. And we listed all the people who voted for it. And out of the 129 people, there were 82 votes for the bill and 32 votes against. And so we see here, of those 82 votes, 56 out of 61 MSPs, 56 SNP MSPs out of 61 SNP MSPs voted for it. One Conservative voted for it. 15 of the Labour MSPs voted for it. That's 15 out of 23 Labour MSPs. All 5 of the Lib Dems voted for it, and all 5 of the Scottish Cabbage Party voted for it. The Scottish Cabbage Party, otherwise known as the Soggy Greens. They all voted for it, surprise, surprise. And of the 32 voting against, 28 of them were Conservatives. 3 Labour people who, because there's so few, need a shout out. That was Joanne Lamont, Jenny Mara and Elaine Smith. And 1 Reform UK MSP who was Michelle Ballantyne, who had defected from the Tories. And there were 4 abstentions. All of these people are to blame. All of these people are to blame. It's not just the SNP and Greens, it's the Lib Dems and the Labour Party as well. And when you think about it, where are the Labour Party and Lib Dem people on this matter today? Are they saying that if they get elected in 2026, at the Holyrood election in 2026, are they saying that they're going to repeal it? Well, I hope that they do, but I'm not hearing them saying it at the moment. If you've heard them say it, please correct me on that matter. So it got passed on the 11th of March, and the time to stop it, the time for the British government to step in and say, oh, well, wait a minute, this offends our British values of freedom of speech. In particular, it offends Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which we've written into the Human Rights Act 1998 in British law. This offends our British principles. We shouldn't have that. The time for the Secretary of State to step in was then. It was prior to it receiving royal assent. That was the time that Alistair Jack had to step in and say, no, you've passed this law, but it's not right. That was the time for him to evoke what's called a Section 35 order. But cast your mind back to that time, March 2021. Boris Johnson was in charge. The country was in lockdown. It seemed that a normal government that dealt with normal things was totally absent without leave. Our politicians, all they were speaking about was keeping us locked in our houses for our own good, apparently. So important things like that were just going with the wind. And indeed, Alistair Jack himself didn't get switched on to this idea of using Section 35 orders until 2 years later, until January 2023, when he finally stepped in after the Scottish Parliament had passed the Gender Recognition and Reform Bill. He finally stepped in back on the 16th of January 2023 and he said, I'm not going to allow that to go to royal assent. And of course, to massive approval. And then a few weeks later, the first casualty, Nicola Sturgeon, resigned. So I wish that Alistair Jack had got switched on to the Section 35 order a lot earlier, and I wish that he had stopped it before it went to royal assent. But he didn't do anything. Did he even know about it? I doubt Boris Johnson even knew about it. Or if he did, he didn't care. Or worse, he agreed with it. Hopefully not, but who can tell these days? Anyway, it went to royal assent, and on the 23rd of April 2021, it became the law, which they shelved and spent 3 years embedding it into civil society before they're ready to spring it on us this year on the 1st of April. Now, I saw somebody say, well, can Rishi Sunak step in and actually stop it? And the answer is theoretically yes, because the British government can make any law it wants. So even at this very late stage, the British Parliament could actually pass a law that says that this act of the Scottish Parliament is to be repealed, and it would be repealed. Now, that's never been done before. That's never been done before, but it is theoretically possible. Now, somebody said, maybe what they're hoping is that they'll just let this bill go ahead and enough people will become disenchanted with it that it'll actually backfire on the SNP, and the SNP will have to rescind it themselves, repeal it themselves, and get egg on their face, and maybe that's the long-term strategy. Maybe, but I don't even think there's much thought going into that at all. And even if that were the case, is it really going to have much of an impact? If the SNP did rescind it, does that mean everybody's then going to start voting Tory? Probably not. Probably means that a few people will stop voting SNP, but it's not going to be like a major thing that's going to happen as far as the fortunes of the Tory party is concerned. But if the Tory party really wanted to create a major political earthquake, if they really wanted to be bold, if they really wanted to be positive, instead of taking this passive, oh, let's just see how it goes, let's just hope that it messes up so badly that the SNP will finally get egg on their face. Instead of going down that passive route, if they really wanted to be bold, imaginative, forthright, positive, then they could say, hey guys, we're passing a law tomorrow to repeal your act. And that would create a political earthquake. Now's the time to do it, just before a general election. You'll divide the population. Lots of people will say, well, I'm not voting Tory. Lots of people would say, I am voting Tory. And it would create a stir. And that's the way that you should work politics, create a stir. Will they do that? I have to say they won't do that, unfortunately. They won't do that, but they could do that. And in my view, they should do that. And in my view, that would be a great thing. And it would show once again that we are a united nation with one unitary state run by the British Parliament. But that sort of bold behaviour is the last thing that this present government, unfortunately, is ever likely to do. So it does seem that we are stuck with it, with this law, and we'll just have to see how things pan out. And it may well be that they do end up with egg on their face, and at the moment that seems to be the only hope that we have there as far as getting rid of the law is concerned. But we shouldn't be too downhearted about these things. And Scotland does have a tradition of this, I have to say. I was reading a book last year, The Union of England and Scotland, 1603 to 1608, and this was just after James the Sixth of Scotland became James the Sixth of Great Britain, and he wanted his kingdom to be politically united, and he put forth various ideas which we've spoken about in one of our Union Heart magazines. He put forth various ideas, and mainly the English weren't up for it, but of course quite a few of the Scots weren't either, because he was a man before his time. But his ideas created a little bit of a stir in Scotland, with some people not liking his idea. And the Scottish Parliament at the day did pass what I would call an anti-free speech law. And it was called an Act Against Scandalous Speeches and Libels. And it was passed on the 24th of June 1609. And the Act condemned the false and calumnious brutish speeches and writings craftily uttered and dispersed by some lawless and foolish people of this realm, as well as in private conferences, as in their meetings at taverns, alehouses, and plays, and by their pasquilles, which is lampoons, libels, rhymes, cockalanies, comedies, and such like occasions, whereby they slander, malign, and revile the people, estate, and country of England, leading to the hindrance of the wished accomplishment of the perfect union of the said kingdoms, as he, James VI, hopes, God willing, in his reign to see. So that was a law passed in 1609 to condemn those who slander, malign, and revile the people, estate, and country of England. I don't know how many people got convicted under that law, but certainly it was an attempt, I suppose, to control political speech in that particular time. However, things are a lot more intense these days, because back then you could say what you liked, and it was only if you had the misfortune of being overheard by somebody with the political power that you would be in the deep end. Whereas today, of course, with social media and so on, everybody's at risk all the time, including in your private habitat, because in the explanatory notes for this act, it says here, if you look at part 60, these are the explanatory notes. This does not form the law, but it explains the law. It says the first element requires the person to behave in a threatening or abusive manner, or to communicate material that is threatening or abusive. Behaviour or material which is threatening or abusive could arise in any setting, such as on social media, such as Facebook, Twitter, at the dinner table, or elsewhere in the home, in an office or workplace, in a teaching environment, including religious education, during a religious sermon, or as part of religious preaching or practice. That's a danger. I don't like that at all. In a public or private meeting, in a newspaper, blog post, or other media setting, when performing, including in a play or a show, on stage, or in a film. That's explanatory note point 60. Goodness me. So that's basically everywhere. Imagine that. Imagine you have a dinner party, or there's somebody sitting around your dinner table who then reports you to the police. Well, I'm afraid that's the end of that friendship. If somebody tries that, that's unbelievable. Not acceptable, quite frankly. Let's see what you guys have got to say. Catherine says, the soggy greens always make us feel downhearted intentionally. They are. They're merchants of doom. They're merchants of demoralisation. David hopes that because of the ECHR contraventions that the hate bill will not stand. People need tough skins. That's absolutely true, Alexander. Head Up says it's methods of divide and conquer. Dividery, not diversity. Christopher says all of this will have massive economic and investment consequences for Scotland. Very possibly so. As Christopher also says, Westminster does need to step in here and show leadership, but somehow I think Sunak lacks the resolve. Alexander says Scotland's always the testing ground. Sometimes it seems like that. Doc Savage thinks it's the WEF that is behind it. He says they bribe politicians to champion their policies. Open borders, for example. You'll own nothing and be happy. The corrupt politicians. I'm just reading out the ones that are not going to contravene the law. This is the man, says Patricia, who thinks that the main statue in George Square is Robert Burns. Did he think that? Yeah. It's Walter Scott, of course, but I doubt that Humza would have a clue on any of that. Patricia says, are you not afraid of being charged under the hate law because you hate the activists for independence? Well, Patricia, we actually love the activists for independence. We like them. We understand that they're misguided, but we don't hate anybody. I mean, hate, ideally, is good not to hate if you can avoid it. It can sometimes just cloud the mind with unnecessary anxiety and unnecessary mental problems and so on. So it's better to have the general Christian view of just loving everybody, including your enemies. I know that's hard to do, obviously, but if you can try to hold to that, yeah, we try to preach love, not hate, as they say, and I think that's important. It's important. But you shouldn't, if somebody hates you, you should try to help them to lose that attitude, Try to say you're wasting your energies on hate. Talking about the poor people who are being accused of hate, though, the Police Scotland have got it in for the 18 to 30-year-old white male population, because as part of their attempts to explain what a hate crime was, they come up with the hate monster that looks like something from a Sugar Puffs advert in the 1980s. And here he is here, the hate monster, or the angry Weetabix, as somebody called him the other day. And it says, have you met the hate monster? And I guess he's talking there about how the hate monster's talking. Sorry, I'm already getting pulled into that. Frame. I guess the Police Scotland person who wrote that is talking about how hate's not good for you. Well, yeah, we know that. But it then goes on to say something which really irritated me here. Why do some people let the hate monster in? We know that young men aged 18 to 30 are most likely to commit hate crime, particularly those from socially excluded communities who are heavily influenced by their peers. Socially excluded communities. Well, you're not doing very much to bring them into the mainstream by referring to them in that way, are you? They may have deep-rooted feelings of being socially and economically disadvantaged. Well, they maybe are socially and economically disadvantaged. I mean, you don't have to have a deep-rooted feeling to be socially and economically disadvantaged if you are socially and economically disadvantaged. Okay, it's maybe they have a deep-rooted understanding of their reality. How about that? It continues that this feeling of being socially and economically disadvantaged is combined with ideas about white male entitlement. Give over, okay? Give over. I would like to speak personally to the person who came up with that, okay? If you're Channel 4 or something like that and you want an interesting conversation, then set me up with the person who wrote that, who's having a go at 18 to 30-year-olds in socially and economically disadvantaged areas, and then dumping on them saying that they've got ideas about white male entitlement. Well, excuse me, if you're an 18 to 30-year-old male in Scotland, you have every right to feel entitled, okay? You have every right to feel that this is your country. You have every right to feel that you should be put first in your own country. That's not entitlement. That's just the way things should be. I feel entitled to live in a country that puts freedom of speech first. I'm entitled to live in a country, and I feel entitled that I should live in a country that respects freedom of speech, that respects freedom of assembly, that has a functioning economy, that doesn't discriminate against people who have every right to be in Scotland and who are born in Scotland, who consider themselves Scottish. You know, white males are entitled to feel that they should be put first because it is their country, along with white females, obviously, as well. So all of that, trying to knock people because they think, because the police or whoever wrote that are saying, oh, you shouldn't feel entitled. Yeah, you damn well should feel entitled to live in this country and to be put first. It's your country. You should be put first. Can't be doing with that attitude of these people. You know, you just feel entitled. Damn right I feel entitled. It's my country. So here's a good quote from George Orwell. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. George Orwell. There you go. Well, do you know what? There's a lot of people who don't want to hear certain things. And they don't want to hear certain things so much that they'll actually make laws to stop themselves hearing it and to frighten others into not saying things that they don't want to hear. So that's what we're up against. That's what we're up against. And we should always remember, I spoke about our values, our British values of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, even for people that we disagree with. Okay, that's the hard bit. But we must stand by that, even for people that we disagree with. And, well, who gave us that right? Who gave us that right? Well, it was those who fought for us in the 20th century. It's those who fought and died. These are rights that we've built over the years. And I like this cartoon here. Somebody on a soapbox talking away, and there's somebody with an SNP t-shirt. That should really be SNP Greens plus Lib Dems and Labour, shouting, "Who gave you the right to spout offensive nonsense in public?" And behind them, the War Memorial comes to life and says, "Me." That's right, that's our tradition, and we should be conscious of that, and we shouldn't be throwing it away. We always mention our wee book, our big book here for the Union, One Big Country, a Big Book for the Union, Volume 1. It's the first of 5 volumes, and this is the volume for this year. So please do go to Amazon, simply search Amazon for quote-unquote One Big Country, and you can get this book. It's only $9.99. It's very easily read, and it sets out what we believe. And if you haven't got a good understanding of what British Unionism is, then this book is the best introduction that there is in the world, without doubt, that's ever been written. And I know that's high praise, but it is also true. It is the best book on this matter that's yet been written, bar none. And it's certainly the most easily understood and digestible, because while there may be other books, they're full of lots and lots and lots and lots of words, which at the end of the day don't actually say what this says in so few words, because concision is what it's all about. Catherine says that Police Scotland material about the 18 to 30-year-olds was sexism and ageist against young men. And you know, that's actually a good point, because it was picking on their protected characteristic, which is age. That's a really good point, actually, Catherine. I like that. That's one of these things that we could complain. Once the law goes on the 1st of April, we could complain against Police Scotland for being ageist against 18 to 30-year-olds. And it also said white males as well. So that falls under the idea that it could be insulting to people based upon their quote-unquote colour, which is Section 4, Paragraph 1. So yeah, you see how it could be applied all over the place. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, our frivolous and vexatious complaints could easily be, such things could be made on all sorts of matters related to that. Alexander says that he'd love to challenge that person that wrote that, because I'm in that age group and I have a right to stand up. Quite right you do. Quite right you do, Alexander. And Christopher says, it speaks volumes about the official hatred directed at the indigenous population of this country. Debbie Beers is spot on, Alistair. Alexander says, George Orwell was trying to warn us. He was trying to warn us, but he could see that, couldn't he? He could see that all of that was coming. Ken says, oh, thank you, 100%, Alistair, well said. Good. Folks, we've had the best viewing figures that we've had for a very long time tonight. When we include Facebook, we've almost got when we include Twitter, we've almost got 800 watching. So that's absolutely fantastic. Thanks. Please do retweet this, get the message out, because we've got a lot to say, needs to be said, and we've got a lot more to say about this. We'll be back next Wednesday on the show, and we'll be talking about this. The government's also been the British government's been setting up new fangled definitions of what is not and what is an extremist. We want to be looking into all of that as well, because we need to know how these things work and what they've got planned for us, and especially what they've got planned for the 18 to 30-year-old white males that live in socially disadvantaged communities, which is the way things are going. Could be an awful lot of people. Good. Folks, we'll be back 7 o'clock next Wednesday from 7 to 8. We've got a guest, an author from America, who's going to be speaking with us. In the meantime, please give us a follow. Please give us a like. And it just remains for me to say, God bless the United Kingdom and God save the King. See you next time.